Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. The coastal air at Naval Base Ventura County carried the sharp scent of salt and burned powder as the range woke to first light. Targets stood in clean lines across the dry flats, steel plates and paper silhouettes waiting for another day of drills. Natalie Brooks rolled her maintenance cart along the concrete pads with a rhythm learned by repetition, police brass, swapped target frames, checked the electronic scoring eyes one by one. On most mornings she moved like a shadow, seen, noted, forgotten. That was how she wanted it. Quiet hands, reliable work, no questions. Down the firing line, Commander Mark Harrington watched his SEALs shoot like a man counting seconds on a fuse. He didn't need to raise his voice, the team read his posture and adjusted on instinct. Ethan Doyle settled behind a semi-auto sniper platform, building a position on bone, not muscle. His groups were tight at mid-range, but the 1,000-yard board would expose anything not drilled into muscle memory. Chief Ryan McCarthy moved among the lanes with a slate and a habit of catching details others missed. The morning felt orderly, controlled, inevitable. Natalie kept her eyes on the ground and let her ears do the watching. She heard the cadence of breathing through suppressors, the slight drag in a bolt that needed lube, the telltale thump of someone loading a mag too hard on a closed bolt. She replaced a battered staple gun, stepped around a stack of sandbags, and made a mental note that Lane 7's wind flag was snagged on the outer grommet. She didn't insert herself. Not her role, not today. Stay small. Stay useful. Stay invisible. Invisible wasn't always her nature. Years ago, long before California and the sea air, Wyoming mornings had carved a different rhythm into her bones. Frost biting the boards of an old porch. Her grandfather, Master Sergeant Thomas Hawkeye Brooks, laying out a bolt action on a wool blanket and asking for distances like a teacher who never tired of the lesson. Map angles. Wind calls. Temperature shifts across pasture and cottonwood breaks. He didn't speak about medals. He spoke about discipline and patience, about letting the shot arrive instead of forcing it. The rifle is a tool. Your mind is the weapon. She learned to be still until stillness did the work for her. At Ventura she wore that stillness like a jacket. When Captain Richard Vaughn strolled past with a pair of visiting officers, she kept moving her cart. When Lieutenant Daniel Cho crossed the catwalk above the control room glass, she fixed a jammed target shuttle and logged the actuator amperage without fanfare. She did the small things perfectly because small things add up. She kept the range honest so other people could be dangerous on purpose. Harrington called a rotation and the line went cold. Ethan worked his dope card with a frown that belonged to someone who hated almost good. Natalie slid a fresh target stack onto her cart and, by habit, glanced downrange through the flats shimmering toward the hill burn. Wind ran left to right in soft breaths, not enough to bully a good shooter, enough to punish tension. She set the feeling aside. Not her place to correct the team. Not her place to say what she knew. Her apartment in Santa Barbara didn't look like a shrine, but there were corners that carried Wyoming forward. A weathered wooden box tucked behind a false baseboard. A folded photo of a ranger in the 70s with eyes that saw farther than lenses. A notebook of ballistics equations with handwriting that pressed too hard into the paper, as if certainty could be carved. She kept those pieces quiet the same way she kept herself quiet. Tools and truth live longer when they aren't paraded. Base traffic picked up as the sun cleared the low clouds. Trucks brought ammo. A forklift hummed behind the maintenance shed. Over the PA, a schedule update clipped through. A pre-deployment qualification window was being pulled up a week. Just enough change to tighten nerves, just enough pressure to expose cracks if they were hiding. Natalie logged the new timeline, verified the target pits were stocked, and checked the backup generator because bad timing loves dead power. Harrington drifted downrange, hands on his hips, a man measuring problems with his eyes. He paused near Natalie's lane. He didn't address her by name, didn't need to, but he nodded, a small, professional acknowledgement that her work removed friction from his. She answered with the same small nod and kept moving. That exchange was their entire relationship, and yet it held more respect than most long conversations. A low memory rose and sat with her for a moment, Hawkeye on the porch at Blue Hour, saying that institutions keep their own time, that some rooms pay more attention to rank than to results, that you don't beat systems by shouting at them, you outlast them by being indispensable. Be so steady they need you even when they don't know why. It wasn't cynicism. It was survival dressed as patience. In the operations building, screens mapped out base assets in clean blocks of color. Cho's analysts ran feeds that never blinked. Somewhere in that maze of permissions and clearances lived names Natalie had only heard in passing. Colonel William Stratton was one of them, a man whose shadow was longer than his job title, a man rumor described with the careful vagueness reserved for power that doesn't want a spotlight. She didn't chase rumors. She kept targets square and batteries charged. Mid-morning heat started to ripple off the concrete. Ethan's groups tightened when he shifted his elbow and let the rifle settle itself. McCarthy scribbled something approving in the margin of his slate. Harrington allowed the smallest exhale that counted as satisfaction. Natalie replaced a cracked pasta roll, swapped a chewed-up staple gun, and thought about lunch like someone pretending to be ordinary. The day had the feel of a coin balanced on its edge. Nothing special if it fell the usual way. History if it didn't. On the perimeter, cameras watched chain link and sagebrush with the kind of attention that assumes bad luck is punctual. On the range, steel waited to ring. In the maintenance bay, Natalie set a torque wrench back in its foam cutout and closed the lid as if sealing a promise. She didn't know how close the fuse was. She only knew that when fuses burn, people revert to their training. Hers was quiet, exact, relentless. The line went hot again. The first sharp report snapped flat across the morning like someone tearing cloth. Birds lifted and settled. Brass arced and clattered. Natalie stood where she always stood, between responsibility and anonymity, counting the small beats of a routine that had never betrayed her. Somewhere beyond the hills, a problem woke up and started walking toward the base. She couldn't see it yet. But she felt the air change, the way planes change before weather, a pressure you only notice if you've lived outside enough to listen. She kept her head down and kept the range perfect, because when storms arrive, the little things are the last line that holds. And the storm didn't knock, it kicked the door. The first concussion came from the admin side of Ventura, a flat hammer of pressure that slapped the range and rolled dust out of the target pits. A column of dark smoke clawed up over the low buildings, followed by the metallic rattle of alarms that don't sound unless someone, somewhere, lost control. The line went from hot to hunted in a heartbeat. Radio spiked. Men looked for angles. Habits reached for cover before minds named the threat. Natalie had already mapped where she would go if things ever went sideways. She slid the maintenance cart behind a concrete barrier, killed the power to a panel that liked to arc when stressed, and counted, 1, 2, 3, small arms fire stitched from the east perimeter, not wild, not warning shots, but measured volleys from people who knew fields of fire. On the northern ridge above the flats, muzzle flashes winked and then vanished, the kind of disciplined rhythm that says someone taught them not to loiter in their own signature. Mark Harrington didn't flinch, he vectoring his team with hands and chin, moving bodies off the line and into cover like chest that bleeds. Little things. Natalie ripped open a Pelican case, snatched spare batteries, sealed the lid, and locked it with muscle memory. Secure what can be secured. Get low. Listen. The second blast rolled through the base and chased itself with sirens and fractured shouting. Chief McCarthy barked into comms, voice clipped, situational updates threading the chaos. Ethan dug behind a barrier, eyes already hunting for the high guns pinning them in place. The team could return fire, but the elevation was bad math. Too many angles favored the other side. The small arms locker in the adjacent bay had a demo rifle slated for a marksmanship lecture later in the week. Natalie knew because she had cleaned it, logged it, and zero-checked it against the house ammo for a quick reference card no one but her would ever read. The key on her ring wasn't meant for moments like this, and yet it was. She moved in the seam between bursts, hugged the shadow line of the cinderblock wall, and slipped into the bay. The case was where it should be, tucked behind a rolling cabinet, foam cut for the M110, mags prepped, glass capped. She worked the action, dry, clean, no grit. Good. Suppressor mounted, optic up, simple dope in her head, wind light but present. Back outside, she didn't crawl to the obvious. She chose a low equipment crate that gave her a slice on the drainage culvert east of the line. Movement there, 3 silhouettes flowing where security cameras rarely bother to look. She set bone to concrete, let her breath find the slow metronome Hawkeye had drilled into her until it lived in her spine, and took the lead man at the bottom of an exhale. The suppressor muted the report to a disciplined cough. The man folded without drama. 2 more corrections, 2 more bodies fell into brush and shadow. The culvert threat ended before it properly began. The ridge still chewed the range. That problem needed angles and patience. Uphill shots lie if you let them. She dialed less than her gut wanted, noted the wind shift off the ocean, and hunted for the muzzle that kept timing the team's movement. A flicker, a shoulder, the hard line of a bipod against rock. She let the scope settle, ignored the pounding world, and pressed. The return fire thinned to a stutter. Another position tried to pick up the slack and found the same conclusion. One by one, the high guns quieted like stubborn instruments accepting a new conductor. Somewhere behind her, Mark adjusted the plan mid-stride. QRF estimates crackled uselessly. 15 minutes might as well be 15 years when you're pinned in the wrong geometry. He needed a lane across 200 yards of nothing to a building that sheltered what mattered, rooms full of systems and storage that opportunists would love to bleed. He asked for cover without asking by name. Natalie heard it anyway. She shifted to an angle that let her work the eastern fence line where a half-dozen shooters pressed for advantage. Suppression isn't glory, it's math and tempo. She walked rounds into places heads wanted to be and made those heads choose another day. The team bounded. 2 forward, 2 hold, then trade. Boots ate concrete. Gear clacked. Adrenaline burned hot and then cold. A machine gunner stepped onto a low roof with a confidence that said no one down there could touch him at that distance in this moment. He was wrong. Natalie cut the arc before it was born. The weapon clattered. He didn't get a second idea. Doors gave way at the weapons facility with a sound every operator knows and most civilians never will. Natalie stayed outside the story and wrote margins with steel. She kept the windows honest, drove curiosity back behind drywall, and counted the beats of her mag like a drummer who loves the song too much to miss a note. Reloads were smooth, practiced in an apartment that didn't advertise why someone would keep a mag pouch in a kitchen drawer. Smoke and grit painted the air. Sirens tangled with shouts and the occasional bad decision from the far edge of the fight. Somewhere, someone yelled contact and meant it. Somewhere else, an engine coughed and died. On the ridge, nothing moved that mattered. In the culvert, silence held. On the fence line, one last shooter made a sprint he shouldn't have believed in and learned that belief isn't armor. Minutes expanded until they felt like a private universe. Then the tone changed, the way fights do when initiative shifts. Mark's voice came back over net with that tight calm you only hear from people who spend their lives at the edge of bad news. Interior clear. Systems intact. Hold perimeter. The words didn't settle the tremor in Natalie's hands so much as give it permission to stop. She broke her position only when the space around her said she could, methodical even in the exhale after adrenaline. Weapon safe. Chamber checked. Gear back where it belonged. She closed the case the way she'd found it, because order is dignity when the world is loud. When she finally stood, knees a little reluctant, Mark was there with the look of a man adding up a column that just changed his budget. He didn't give a speech, he didn't need to. Respect can be quiet. The base was no longer orderly. The map in the ops building would show too many red blocks and blinking edges. Captain Vaughn would be having the worst kind of meeting. Cho would be digging through feeds with analysts who smelled like coffee and stress. Sirens would fade and then return with fresh uniforms who wanted to help and couldn't decide if they were late or lucky. Natalie stepped back into the shadow she'd left, the one labeled maintenance, the one that had room for someone who didn't ask to be seen. After events like this, the air tastes like pennies and dust. People talk louder than they need to. Doors open and close without purpose. In a small office near the range, an old photo in a worn wallet looked up and found its grandchild. Hawkeye didn't believe in fate. He believed in preparation meeting need. He would have said today wasn't a miracle, it was an invoice. Skills loaned to the quiet come due in noisy hours. Outside, the smoke thinned, and the sun returned to pretending this was another California morning. Natalie logged what could be logged, fixed what could be fixed, and let the rest sit where command would pick it up. The storm had swept through. It hadn't finished its business. In the distance, sirens receded toward other problems, other edges. Inside the wire, new eyes started to notice the woman who used to be part of the furniture. And in that shift, small and dangerous, the next fuse took light. And crawled straight into the places where decisions were uniforms. Debrief started before the smoke fully left the range. Rooms went cold, blinds half closed, a camera in the corner blinking like a metronome that records careers. Captain Vaughn opened with procedure and moved to pressure. Who authorized what? Why an M110 left a locked case? How an unbadged civilian made shots that usually sit inside classified training slides. Natalie sat with her hands still, shoulders square, voice even. She kept it simple, a threat, a tool, a result. Mark confirmed the timeline and the angles, never dressing it up. McCarthy's notes backed the numbers. Ethan, quiet and annoyed with himself for not seeing the ridge fast enough, spoke a clean truth that left no room for rumor. Lieutenant Cho rolled footage from perimeter cams, slowed frames, overlaid telemetry. He admired facts, not legends. The ridge shooters used real technique. The culvert approach exploited blind spots that live on spreadsheets but rarely get tested. Whoever planned the hit had help, or had studied Ventura harder than anyone liked. Cho marked timestamps and started threads for his analysts. He didn't say Stratton out loud, but the room felt the weight of that name. It hung like a low beam you learn to duck. By afternoon, the base looked normal in the way disaster scenes feel normal if you haven't lived through the morning. Tape replaced panic. Reports replaced shouting. The maintenance base smelled like solvent and burned metal. Natalie replaced a motor in the target shuttle for Lane 5 and pretended her world was small again. It didn't hold. A pair of visitors with clean suits and tired eyes arrived under polite escort. Special Agent Matthew Klein introduced himself and his partner without smiling. He asked questions that knew the answers. He pressed where stories crack. He watched Natalie like someone evaluating a tool he might need later or might need to remove. Klein called it a preliminary interview. He left the recorder on the table and the door slightly open. He asked about training. She said maintenance and household ranges in Wyoming. He asked about exposure to military weapons. She said inventory and cleaning under supervision as required by the job. He asked who taught her to read wind at distance. She didn't blink. My grandfather. He wrote notes that weren't about wind. He closed the folder with a soft tap, thanked her for her time, and told Vaughn he'd be around for a few days to help coordinate. It sounded helpful. It wasn't friendly. Mark caught up with Natalie outside, not with a pep talk, but with logistics. For the next 48 hours, she should avoid being alone on base. If she needed anything from her apartment, he'd have someone go with her. Not because you can't handle yourself, he said, because other people want to know what we're going to do next. She nodded. She understood the difference between safety and optics. Both can get you killed if you misread them. That night, Santa Barbara felt too quiet. Streetlights made honest shadows. Her apartment held its neutral smell of coffee and oil and paper. She locked the door and set her bag down without turning on the TV. The wooden box with Hawkeye's initials waited in its usual place behind the false baseboard. She pulled it out like she had 100 times, not to worship it, but to sort it. Photos. A service patch. A range book with pencil scars. At the bottom, a small notebook with a cracked spine and a rubber band that gave up years ago. She'd read it before. Not all of it. She had always stopped at the same pages when the writing changed tone, when coordinates started appearing in margins, when names lost vowels to abbreviations and dates paired with airfields she could find on a map if she tried. She read past her old stop line. A place in Colorado, not named straight, sketched with landmarks only someone local would recognize, a rust-colored service road, a split in a stand of lodgepole pine, an old research facility with a door that faced north to hide glare. A word in all caps, Redwood. The entry was short. Transfer handled. Not clean. Keep copies. A line later, a note in a different hand, Mercer's script from old photos, insurance moved off-site. Insurance. Natalie closed the notebook and sat with the quiet. Insurance meant leverage. Leverage meant risk. Risk meant someone in the present still cared. Her phone buzzed on the counter with a number she didn't know. She let it ring, then go dark, then ring again. She answered on the third call because people who call 3 times believe they're not optional. The voice was older, roughened, careful. You don't know me, he said, but you know my handwriting. She didn't speak. The voice continued. Name's Jonathan Mercer. Your grandfather and I kept each other alive more than once. I was supposed to be finished. I'm not. You stirred a nest today. They'll come twice, once with questions, once with cleanup. You don't want to be there for the second. She didn't ask how he got the number. People like Mercer collect ways in and never throw them out. He offered one piece of advice and one instruction. Advice, don't debate with suits who arrive with answers. Instruction, there's a cabin outside Aspen. Margaret Ellison will meet you if I ask her to. She has what your grandfather didn't burn. If you want choice instead of reaction, go now. He gave a route that avoided interstates and cameras that read plates for a living. He hung up before she could decide whether she believed ghosts. Morning brought official posture. Klein returned with a polite request for a longer interview downtown. Vaughn didn't love it, but he understood the game. Mark stood in the corner and said nothing to the agent and everything to Natalie with his eyes. Choice sits on timing. She made hers. I'll give you an hour, she told Klein. After that, I need to check on repairs off base. It was true enough to pass a sniff test. It wasn't honest about direction. The hours stretched and thinned. Klein probed the morning fight, then shifted to biography. He asked about financial pressures and family. He asked about anyone who might hold influence. He set small traps to see if she'd step. She didn't. When the wall clock hit 61 minutes, she stood. He raised a hand, not to stop her, but to mark where her spine lived. We'll talk again, he said. It sounded like weather. She left without promising a forecast. Mark met her in the lot with a canvas duffel and a folded map like it was 1998 again. You were never here, he said, handing over a burner and a packet with cash and a list of safe numbers that looked like they belonged to old diners. He didn't ask where she was going. He didn't tell her not to go. He put his hand on the door frame and paused. If you find something we can use, don't carry it alone. And don't send it from anywhere that knows your name. Santa Barbara slipped into the rearview. The 101 gave way to smaller roads that learned the coastline before turning inland where hills rise and cell service pretends it has better things to do. Natalie drove like someone who understands that attention is a currency and she wants change, not bills. She used the burner to send a single word to a number Mark had written, rolling. No names. No locations. Just proof of motion. Wyoming taught her patience. California taught her roads. Colorado would test the space between. She hit gas stations that smelled like dust and long-haul coffee. She watched mirrors not for blue lights, but for the same sedan twice. The radio stayed off. The notebook sat in the glove compartment, a soft heartbeat against the plastic. By dusk the Rockies lifted out of the horizon like something earned. Aspen's edges welcome tourists who think mountains are pretty and forget they're also old and mean. Natalie took a service road that didn't look like one, followed Mercer's directions past a rusted cattle gate and a sign that used to warn about research access. The cabin appeared as a darker rectangle against trees. A single warm light cut the green. An older woman stepped onto the porch with the posture of someone who had read too many files to be surprised by visitors. You must be Brooks, she said. I'm Margaret. Inside, the air held books and old paper. Maps on the wall pinned with colored thread. A radio that liked to hum even when quiet. Margaret poured coffee and slid a thin folder across the table. He told me you'd come when the world made you. The folder held copies, then copies of copies. Names with black bars and dates with circles. A photo of a door facing north on a concrete blockhouse, snow piled along its base, and a code scribbled in the margin that matched Hawkeye's numbers. Redwood, Margaret said, not dramatic, just tired. He hid the last clean set near there. Stratton built a career making sure no one ever matched the sets. Natalie ran a thumb along the edge of the photo and felt the steady return. Not destiny. Just work. Outside, night layered deeper over the pines. Inside, the next map opened on the table. If the morning on the range had been the first invoice, this was the statement of account. Payment due at Redwood. And the mountains collect in full. Before dawn, the cabin dimmed its light and the map on Margaret's table became a checklist. Coordinates committed to muscle. Routes sketched to avoid gates and lenses. Natalie packed what mattered, a compact carbine for close trouble, the M110 for answers at distance, a slim pack with batteries, drives, tape, and a radio that didn't care about cell towers. Margaret loaded a thermos and a folded letter sealed with tape that had yellowed. If you can't open doors with facts, she said, open them with history. Mercer called once, just breathing for a second before giving one last correction on a spur road that snowplows forget. Then silence, the useful kind. They moved before traffic, taking a service road that braided through lodgepole and rock. Frost bit the shoulders. The sky scraped from black to iron. Natalie felt the old Wyoming steadiness return, the quiet that lives between intent and action. The blockhouse appeared where the notebook said it would, a concrete shape with a north-facing door ribbed in steel, a relic that pretended to be dead. It wasn't. A warm exhaust ghosted from a side vent. Cameras swept in lazy arcs like bored sentries who still do their job. No flags, no markings, no welcome. Mark arrived from the opposite ridge with McCarthy and Ethan, shapes that broke and rebuilt against the pines. He had left Ventura on paper-thin leave that wouldn't survive a phone call. He came anyway, a choice written in the set of his jaw. They didn't waste time on greetings. Margaret pointed once at the camera rhythm. Ethan took a glass and found the blind slice that would let them reach a maintenance hatch without teaching the whole forest their names. Redwood's perimeter fence didn't argue, it just asked for patience. Natalie let her hands do what repetition had taught them, quiet cutters, measured tension, fabric peeled back like a breath held and released. Inside the wire, the ground changed texture, poured aggregate over decades of secrets. Close meant carbine. Distance meant the long gun would wait. McCarthy set a clock in his head and started counting down from the moment the first sensor noticed a world not as scheduled. The hatch resisted like a habit. Margaret's letter became a shim, a code, a memory of procedures older than the guards on payroll. It gave. Inside, a corridor that smelled like dust and paper and a faint thread of oil. Fluorescence hummed in a frequency that makes nerves itch. The maps had warned of dead zones and noise traps. Cho would have loved the puzzle. Cho wasn't here. They moved anyway. First room, empty shelves and an old projector that had seen better wars. Second, a records cage with fresh locks that didn't match the age of the door. Third, a vault face with a keypad that pretended numbers alone mattered. Hawkeye's notebook offered a sequence and a pressure cadence drawn in neat arrows. Natalie followed the rhythm like a song she'd practiced without knowing why. The bolt seat thumped in a way that means yes. Inside the vault, not piles, not chaos, but curated proof. Ledgers with matching copies, transmittal receipts, inventory tallies that made sense if you spoke bureaucracy. And in the back, a narrow safe with a handle greased yesterday. Margaret's breath caught the way old soldiers do when ghosts decide to become tangible. She found the envelope she had been promised 40 winters ago, photos, memos, a microfilm spool labeled in Hawkeye's hand, insurance that refused to die. They didn't have time to admire the architecture of truth. The outer cameras had finally told someone who could act. Engines arrived as a low rumble filtered through concrete. McCarthy checked his countdown and said what everyone knew, they were out of safe minutes. Mark weighed the choices like a man who had practiced this scene in dreams. If they ran blind, Redwood would reset and bury itself deeper. If they stood, they would drown in numbers. There was a third path he didn't like, split the problem into pieces the enemy couldn't chase all at once. Natalie built a field scanner on the vault floor with parts that didn't advertise their pedigree. She imaged the microfilm into clean, redundant slices, cross-checked hashes onto 2 separate drives, and labeled them without labels, one for exposure, one for leverage. Margaret stuffed originals into a weatherproof tube and strapped it against her spine with tape and stubbornness. Ethan and McCarthy reoriented the hallway into a funnel that would punish hurry. The first contact came soft, boots on concrete, the whisper of suppressed weapons clearing arcs, men who believed in their own quiet. Natalie killed the front light with a breaker pop and let the corridor become a metronome of muzzle flashes. She counted frames and moved by memory, angling fire to shape their advance into something predictable. Mark didn't waste a trigger pull. He adjusted air. He shaved seconds off bad decisions. He took the space that makes teammates faster. In the crush, a new sound cut through, a voice on an external speaker ordering compliance in words that carry liability language. Special Agent Klein's timbre, official and tidy, riding in on a convoy he shouldn't have legally led. He offered terms, step out, hands visible, bring nothing. It was the kind of politeness that precedes erasure. Margaret smiled without humor. They came with answers, she murmured, repeating Mercer's warning. Choices concentrate at the top of a bell curve. Mark made his. He keyed his radio to a frequency Cho had once described as the hole in the donut, a gap between systems where signals go to be ignored. He pushed a burst packet containing hash summaries and a terse message to a list of numbers Mark shouldn't have had, an inspector general desk, a congressional aide who dislikes surprises, a reporter who knows how to verify before she burns. Not the package, not yet, just the map that said a package existed and where to look if the carrier vanished. It was treason if you squinted. It was duty if you remembered your oath. Klein's men tried the push. Ethan let the first stack in and broke it in the middle. McCarthy handled the second like he'd choreographed it. Natalie moved to the vault lip and stole the pace, cutting angles with fire that made men pick safety over salary. She felt Hawkeye's steady hand on her shoulder even if she knew it was only muscle memory. Margaret slid past with the tube as if she were made of smoke. They exfiltrated through the maintenance labyrinth, a geometry lesson with consequences. Vents that fit one person at a time. Ladders that drop into dark where your feet have to trust your hands. Behind them, Redwood shrugged and began to rewrite its own logs, an organism designed to survive embarrassment. At the hatch, cold air slapped faces hot from fluorescent hum. The forest swallowed them with the casual mercy of tall trees. Outside the fence, a second convoy crept along the service road, men with patches you can't Google because the companies rename themselves every fiscal year. Stratton's insurance policy, arriving to make sure the record matched the narrative. Between the two forces lived a sliver of conflict that could be exploited. Mark took it. He walked into Klein's line of sight from cover long enough to be identified, then vanished again toward the mercenaries' blind side. Radios began to argue. Orders overlapped. Accountability reared its head, and guns hesitated because careers hate crossfire. Natalie used the hesitation like oxygen. She shepherded Margaret downhill, feet choosing pine needles over gravel, the tube knocking once against a rib to confirm it still existed. Ethan ghosted their flank, breaking pursuit when it gathered. McCarthy seeded false trails with heat packets and bits of reflective tape placed to flirt with cameras. The forest was old, it had seen bigger panics. Half a mile out, a service culvert cut under the road to a drainage that forgot it had a name. Mercer had said to trust the culvert. They did. Cold water ate at shins. Rock tore at knuckles. On the far side, a battered pickup waited under a blue tarp that matched the sky nobody bothered to admire. The keys were in the visor like clichés or sometimes plans. Margaret slid behind the wheel without ceremony. The tube rode under the bench. Natalie climbed in and stared once back through the trees where men with overlapping missions tried not to make the kind of mistake that ends hearings. They drove gravel like it could file fingerprints off tires. The radio stayed dead on purpose. 10 minutes became 30. 30 became the stretch of highway where mountains dump into plains and you remember that America is big enough to hide if you move smart. In the glove compartment, the drive with the exposure copy clicked lightly against a registration no one would read. At a turnout overlooking a valley that held fog like a secret, Mark's SUV rolled up from a different road. He stepped out with the look of someone who had burned his bridge and didn't regret the view. He handed Natalie a satchel with a small satellite unit older than good taste. "When you're in the clear," he said, "send the full set to all the places I started calling. Send it to more. Don't trust a single basket." He didn't add the part where this choice ended some chapters of his life. It was in the way he squared his shoulders. Far behind them, Redwood receded into trees and myth. Closer, the wind carried nothing but cold and the promise of movement. Margaret rested her palm on the tube as if feeling a pulse. Natalie looked at the satchel, then at the road curling east, then at the thin line of morning sharpening on the rim of clouds. Climaxes aren't fanfare, they're pressure deciding where to go. She turned the key, checked mirrors out of habit, and drove toward the place where proof stops being a possession and becomes a weapon. And weapons only matter if they hit what they're aimed at. Fog sat low over the valley while the old satellite unit found sky. Natalie built a quiet desk on the tailgate, drives, battery brick, folded map as a pad, the sat unit angled to the cold. She verified hashes against the burst packet Mark had already fired into the world, then zipped the full set through multiple channels at once, Inspector General inboxes that route to locked rooms, an oversight staffer with a habit of saving copies off-network, a reporter whose last 3 stories survived lawyers. No manifestos. No drama. Each message carried the same plain container, document images, microfilm scans, the ledger that tied contracts to shell companies, the memo with Stratton's initials in the margin authorizing transfers that never made any official book. Proof doesn't explode, it erodes. But you can speed erosion by choosing the right current. The first reply came shockingly fast, an AutoAct from an .gov address set to flag certain keywords. The second, minutes later, was human, a terse, received, verifying, from a staffer who knew better than to promise anything over a wire. The reporter didn't write back at all, which was how you knew she was working. Margaret watched the progress bars without blinking, one hand on the weatherproof tube like a heartbeat monitor. Ethan and McCarthy ran a lazy circle security that wasn't lazy at all. Mark stood off to the side, shoulders square, eyes turned toward the thin line of road where friends turn into problems when phones ring. When the last packet cleared, Natalie didn't feel triumph, she felt responsibility migrate outward. Owning a secret is simple. Sharing it multiplies outcomes. They broke down the tailgate office and moved. The pickup took the service roads, then a state route that wore last winter's scars. At a diner that still trusted cash and coffee refills, Margaret slid into a back booth and used a payphone that somehow worked. She made one call to an old DIA contact who owed her a favor from a year with no name. She said nothing specific, only pushed a rumor toward a hearing room. Rumors are invitations for subpoenas. By afternoon, the first ripples became visible to anyone who knew where to look. A secure fax pinged the base legal shop at Ventura with a hold notice on certain records. An IG investigator asked for a meeting with Captain Vaughn to understand base procedures and incident response. Cho's analysts, who had been chewing thread since the range attack, received a classified tasking that matched the hash Mark had fired. Cho didn't smile, he underlined 3 lines on a whiteboard and erased 2 that had felt like dead ends. The system that had ignored whispers was now obliged to listen to documents. Klein felt the shift too. He arrived back at Ventura with a face that telegraphed pressure he couldn't name. He asked for Natalie and was told she was off base on maintenance business. He asked for Mark and got a version of leave that read like absence with intent. He walked out to the range and stared at empty targets until the wind flipped a flag and he remembered he had bosses. Redwood didn't vanish, but it started to molt. The contract company covering the site changed names overnight, switching the logo on invoices while claiming no change in operational control. Strategically, that's as loud as shouting. Stratton's office issued a bland statement about legacy programs and routine document preservation. The reporter posted nothing, but her newsroom's legal team reserved a conference room and told security to plan for cameras. Night came in clean and sharp above the planes as Natalie, Mark, and the others reached a safe motel that priced rooms by the hour but accepted multiple nights if you paid forward. They took 2 rooms with adjoining door and made the kind of camp that erases footprints, trash bagged and hauled, towels counted, blinds set to angles that discourage cameras. Margaret slept sitting up for 20 minutes at a time, old training wrapped in new bones. Ethan wrote a list of serials they had seen on weapons at Redwood, numbers that would connect to procurement lines someone would now be forced to explain. McCarthy laminated nothing, but he memorized everything. Morning hit with the soundless momentum of bureaucracy finally choosing to move. The oversight staffer sent a short encrypted note, "Your set cross-checks against unrelated subpoena." Proceeding to closed session at 1400. If you have additional context on item Redwood 17, send now. Natalie had context, Hawkeye's margin notes about a transfer that bypassed Army channels, funneled through a private logistics hub in Colorado Springs. She packaged the page images with a sentence of placement and pushed them into the same currents. She didn't editorialize. Facts don't need hype when they can be triangulated. News broke not as a bang but as a crawl at the bottom of a screen most people ignore until the anchor's tone changes. Sources confirm congressional staff reviewing documents related to Legacy Intelligence Program, questions raised about contracting and oversight. No names. No specifics. Enough oxygen to keep the fire from smothering. Natalie let the sound play while she tightened the straps on her duffel. Relief didn't visit. Focus did. They staged a second distribution for redundancy, a dead drop in a university library locker where a student group kept flyers, and a prepaid package addressed to a lawyer who made careers defending whistleblowers he never met. Multiple baskets, multiple clocks. If one door slammed, another would already be half open. Back at Ventura, Vaughn found himself in a room with people who wore concern like cologne. Procedure questions turned into liability questions. Liability questions turned into timelines. He held the line where he could and yielded where he had to. Cho briefed quietly, threading the needle between cooperation and survival. By naming patterns and not names, he walked the team onto solid ground without shoving anyone into a hole they'd never climb out of. In a hallway after the meeting, he paused by a bulletin board and straightened a crooked safety poster. Little things, even here. Klein made his own choice. He requested a reassignment to avoid conflicts during ongoing reviews, language designed to read as noble. In truth, he was stepping off a boat he suspected might capsize under someone else's weight. He didn't call Natalie. He didn't have to. The absence of pursuit said enough. Late afternoon brought the first tangible break. The reporter went live with a tightly constructed piece that never overreached. She showed documents, metadata scrubbed, serials matched to public contracting databases, dates that lined up with old appropriations. She didn't say Stratton's name. She used phrasing that makes lawyers nervous for the right reasons. According to records, internal memos indicate a facility consistent with descriptions of, but the shape was undeniable. Phones lit in places that prefer email. Hill staffers asked for briefings. The word hearing stopped being hypothetical. Stratton blinked. His office canceled 2 appearances and announced a press availability to clear up misinformation. That phrase never clears anything. Margaret watched the clip and exhaled a laugh that wasn't kind. He'll pick a scapegoat, she said, then threatened to retire for health reasons. If he does it fast enough, some people will take the trade. Natalie didn't argue. The point wasn't revenge, it was removing the fuse from the next bomb. They drove at dusk to a ridge that looked down on a town that hadn't been asked to host history. The SAT unit pushed a final bundle, a copy set to a sealed court clerk drop that would only open if a judge's order reference to Natalie had embedded in 3 earlier transmissions. Systems hate being gamed. They respect their own rules. She used those rules like she used wind. By nightfall, the team's geometry changed from flight to posture. They weren't safe, but the chase had shifted from roads to rooms where microphones sit in nameplates. Mark sat on the motel step with the posture of a man taking inventory of what his choices cost and what they saved. He would not go back to the version of his career that existed a week ago. He seemed okay with that. Ethan called his mother and talked about weather. McCarthy cleaned a bolt carrier without looking at it, hands doing ritual while mind idled. Margaret finally slept flat for an hour and didn't jolt awake. Natalie took a walk under a sky so clear it felt like Wyoming had followed her west. She thought about Hawkeye's notes, about patience as a tactic and proof as a tool, about the way small, exact actions stand up when noise gets loud. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a mechanic who found the right wrench for a seized engine and turned, steady, until the threads broke free. In the morning, an email waited from the oversight staffer. Closed session is moving to open. Prepare for collateral. Collateral meant headlines and hearings and people who didn't deserve heat catching some anyway. It also meant sunlight. She forwarded the note to Mark without comment. He replied with 2 words, stay moving. Resolution isn't quiet, it's a different kind of noise. Phones. Doors. Cameras. Somewhere, under all that hum, a system that had preferred shadows adjusted to daylight. The documents no longer belonged to Natalie or to Margaret or to Hawkeye's careful hand. They belonged to the record. And once the record starts to grow teeth, men like Stratton learn that control is rented, not owned. Stay moving, that phrase carried her into the final stretch, a reminder that stillness invites eyes while momentum writes its own cover. The hearings broke open faster than anyone predicted. C-SPAN carried words no one expected to hear: redwood, unauthorized transfer, contracting irregularities. Faces that had practiced calm now sweated under lights. Stratton appeared at the podium, voice clipped, jaw tight, claiming misinterpretation and political theater. But the documents spoke in their own language, ledgers with numbers, memos with signatures, serials that matched crates no one could deny. Truth didn't need adjectives. It needed daylight, and daylight had arrived. Natalie watched from a motel television where the volume sat low. Margaret sat beside her, hands folded, eyes heavy but steady. Mark leaned against the dresser, expression unreadable. Ethan and McCarthy flipped through channels, switching between networks to see which angles stuck. Each channel said the same thing in a different accent: Redwood was real, money had moved, oversight had failed, and a colonel once untouchable now faced questions with teeth. The word resignation floated like a trial balloon. Stratton batted it down, but the balloon didn't fall, it lingered, waiting for gravity. For the first time in weeks, Natalie felt the chase ease. Not gone, but softened, like a fever breaking. She stepped outside, into the cold air that tasted like pine and distance, and thought about Wyoming mornings. Hawkeye had said institutions forget people but remember documents. She understood now. She had become a courier for his last message, one written in margins and sealed with patience. It wasn't destiny, it was obligation answered. Within days, subpoenas multiplied. Reporters dug deeper. The oversight staffer sent another note, shorter this time, collateral absorbed. Stay quiet. Klein's name disappeared from rosters, his transfer processed into a bureau corner where cases go to retire. Vaughn held on to his post, bruised but respected for cooperation. Cho's analysts got promoted under the cover of expanded responsibilities. Mercer never called again, which meant he was either safe enough not to, or gone enough not to. Margaret returned to Aspen with fewer documents but lighter shoulders, her role finished the moment sunlight touched the records. Mark made his choice final. He filed retirement papers with a signature that shook just slightly, then drove to Wyoming to see ground Hawkeye once walked. He left Natalie with a line: "You've got what it takes to stay invisible, or to stand tall. Just don't confuse the two." Ethan and McCarthy rotated back into training cycles, their careers intact, their loyalty unspoken but clear. Natalie didn't stay in Santa Barbara. The apartment felt like a shell, its quiet corners now heavy with echoes. She sold it, took the notebooks and the photo box, and headed inland. Wyoming ranch roads knew her name better than city streets did. On the porch where Hawkeye once laid out a rifle on wool, she set the notebook flat, pages open to the coordinates now burned into history. She didn't read them again. They had done their job. She left the book on the table, spine cracked, as a reminder that even paper can outlast men who think themselves untouchable. The world moved on. Stratton announced retirement for health reasons 2 weeks after the first open hearing. His name dissolved into footnotes and talking head debates. Redwood became shorthand in news cycles for failure and secrecy. Politicians built careers off promising it would never happen again. None admitted that it already had, countless times, in smaller rooms with less paper. Natalie didn't chase those echoes. She understood her chapter was finished. On a clear morning, she set up a steel plate at the edge of the ranch, wind flags whispering. She laid down behind Hawkeye's old bolt gun, wood worn smooth, scope fogged at the edges. She built the position like muscle memory had taught her, breath steady, heart calm. The shot cracked across open ground and rang the plate with a sound that folded time. She smiled, not at triumph, but at continuity. The skills weren't destiny. They were discipline, inherited and honored. That night she sat by a small fire, listening to Coyote's call. Her phone buzzed once, a single line from Mark, "Stay moving." She typed no reply. She didn't need to. The story had already traveled farther than either of them ever would. Proof had teeth now. Truth had a record. Hawkeye's invoice was paid. And in the quiet of Wyoming night, Natalie Brooks let herself believe in something rare, that sometimes, in the long fight between shadows and light, the ledger can balance, even if only for a while.